We are now officially only 1 week away from E3, and I gotta tell ya, my body is more than ready for this. Now, I know, we've been burned before in the past, where we expected Breath of the Wild 2 to show up and it just didn't. However, with all the rumors floating around, paired with the fact that Aonuma promised we would see the game later this year, I am more than confident that this might be the one. Where else than on the big stage at E3 would be a better time? E3 and Zelda has become sort of a tradition at this point. 2002, 2004, 2010, 2014, 16, and of course 2019. And I'm sure I'm forgetting even more. After the dumpster fire that was 2020, which left us without an E3 altogether, I think we are now ready to hear what happened for what feels like 100 years ago since they announced this damn game. Although I am confident that the sequel will show up at this year's presentation, I don't think it's gonna be as massive as a blowout as some people are speculating. I expect something similar to 2016 with Breath of the Wild. A bigger, better trailer with gameplay footage this time around, a title reveal so we can hopefully finally stop calling it Breath of the Wild 2, and maybe a release date, or at the very least a release year if they're not yet ready to make promises on that front. So to give this hype train one final boost before entering the weekend of June 12, I'm gonna do one last Breath of the Wild 2 theory / prediction. And when I say prediction, I of course mean wild guesses, since we cannot really know anything. So join me as we take one final look at a gameplay possibility for The Legend of Zelda: The Smurglebob Chronicles. Title copyrighted by Nintendo. Ever since the game's reveal, there's one topic that has stood out among Zelda videos, at least when it comes to gameplay possibilities, which is, of course, the underground. Right after the E3 reveal, Aonuma stated that he wanted to revisit this rendition of Hyrule, something that left some people a bit worried, since as vast as the overworld was, pretty much every nook and cranny of this landscape has been scrutinized in the past 4 years. What else is there to do at this point? More quests, a new story event, and yet even more shrines will probably not be enough to avoid the game from feeling like the DLC it was originally intended to be. So naturally, once we saw Link and Zelda traversing a vast cave, we concluded that Hyrule may have a wide array of caves, underground ruins, and maybe even entire subterranean cities to explore. Another widely discussed idea is underwater exploration, and for good reason. Many Zelda games have featured it in the past. Horizon is doing it for its sequel, and given the fact that Breath of the Wild was all about player freedom, not being able to venture beneath the waves of Hyrule's lakes and oceans was definitely one of a few restrictions that clashed with the open world design philosophy, apart from petting dogs. And no, I'm never gonna let this go. Who's your good boy? Who's your good boy? You are. Yes, you are. Alright, I'm gonna let this go. For now. So we have underground and underwater, both of which feature descending down on the Z-axis. Assuming the Zelda team won't expand the map beyond its current borders, that leaves us with one more direction to go. After all, the Z-axis doesn't only go down, but up as well. Now, I'm definitely not the first to pitch this idea. People have been calling for the return of Loftwings, a return to Skyloft, and even outer space in some cases since the very beginning. But what I want to do today is show you some interesting speculation, hints, and observations that other people have pointed out to me in the past weeks, as well as give you some of my own takes on the matter that shows that gameplay featuring aviation could be a possibility. Because when you think about it, for a game that calls itself open air rather than the traditional open world, there wasn't really all that much to the sky in Breath of the Wild. Sure, paragliding around was nice, but other than that, it's mostly just a case of holding forward on the control stick. Airborne enemies were often conveniently hovering only a few feet off the ground. The only exceptions were the floating platforms, which were only present in Master Mode and part of DLC Pack 1, and some very specific scripted events such as entering Vah Meadow and the fight with the malice-infested Naydra, both of which required the use of perpetual updrafts which weren't there under normal circumstances. And this is not meant to be a criticism of Breath of the Wild. There was a lot to explore on the surface, which is where the main focus lies. The paraglider was there to make traversal faster, more fun to do, and encourage climbing to high places and finding vantage points. Back in 2017, its inclusion was pretty novel. Rarely had we seen this level of freedom before. Being able to glide around from anywhere to anywhere was amazing, but as was to be expected, since then other games have started to implement similar mechanics, like Genshin Impact, and even Horizon Forbidden West recently revealed a similar feature. Because of this and the fact that Breath of the Wild is 4 years old now, the mechanic doesn't feel as special anymore. But as stated before, this isn't about Breath of the Wild, but its sequel. And for the sequel, we need more than just a few new landmarks to explore. So next I want to talk about a few things. A, the means by which Link can take flight, B, the possible story implications, and C, some additional gameplay elements that could come into play if this is realized. The paraglider was designed to slowly descend, not ascend, so it either needs to get an upgrade that does allow Link to soar upwards like Revali's Gale, except not restricted to a single grounded boost, or a completely new power, mount, or device to do so. One option I discussed with Andre's Restart on his podcast not too long ago was the return of Loftwings. I've been very skeptical about the idea of Loftwings returning, since Nintendo rarely brings back central mechanics from previous titles. There are exceptions like Phantom Hourglass revisiting Wind Waker Sailing, but this doesn't happen often. The wall merging mechanic from A Link Between Worlds, the mass transformations from Majora's Mask, Wolf Link, traveling by train, none of these have ever made a return in the same way. That's kind of the way Nintendo rolls. They come up with a unique central mechanic and then it's gone afterwards. Some may see this as a negative, but at the same time it's also what still gives the Zelda series its right to exist, even after more than 20 installments. However, there is one thing that made me more open to the possibility of Loftwings, that being the recent introduction of the Loftwing amiibo. Now, do I think Loftwings will play a central role in Breath of the Wild 2? No. But it could at least be possible that it will unlock something extra. And before you start sweating because you can't or won't buy the Loftwing amiibo, I'm not saying that this will be the only way to obtain a Loftwing. Instead, you could compare it to Epona, who was only available through amiibo, but other horses still exist. So perhaps the amiibo will unlock Link's Crimson Loftwing from Skyward Sword as a reward for buying the amiibo. If Loftwings were to make a return in Breath of the Wild 2, this would be only one of a few times that Nintendo has brought back a core mechanic from a previous game. But in this case, I think it would be totally justified, because as those of you who've already played Skyward Sword know, this was a very underdeveloped aspect of the game. Ever since the reveal of Skyward Sword, the main selling point which got the most attention beside the motion controls was flying around on your bird. But there wasn't really all that much to it. There were no enemies to fight in the sky. Heck, Link couldn't even use any of his weapons while airborne. All the Loftwing was good for was landing on things and as a way to reach the surface. That's it. I think Breath of the Wild 2 could do so much more with this concept. That being said, this doesn't mean it has to be achieved through the use of Loftwings, of course. There are other alternatives. An obvious one would be a return to the Sheikah tech once more. The Master Cycle Zero demonstrated the superiority of the Sheikah technology for traversal on land. So what if this time around Link obtains a new vehicle that can fly, perhaps built by Robbie or Purah, a device which can be upgraded as you progress through the main story. Similar to the Master Cycle, it may require fuel, and at first the amount of airtime you can get out of it is limited, but similar to the stamina gauge, upgrades can make it fly longer or higher as you go. In creating a champion, we can see that Nintendo was initially thinking about the inclusion of vials or syringes filled with ancient energy. By the looks of it, they were meant to power the Sheikah Slate, but I guess that got scrapped to make use of the Slate more convenient without having to fill it up each time. But for a vehicle, portable and obtainable ancient energy would make perfect sense. Another option, which we already got a very brief glimpse of, could be Link's Magic Spirit Arm. We still have no idea what this means for the gameplay, but if we do some wild speculation here, what if this is what grants Link the power of temporary flight? It could either manipulate Link's paraglider, allowing him to ascend while gliding, or perhaps Link won't even need a paraglider, and the hand allows him to Superman his way around for short periods of time. I know this sounds crazy, but I mean, whatever this being is, it seems to house itself or its power into Link. And if this being turns out to be a sage or maybe even a Twilight, both of which have shown to be able to hover or fly, perhaps this ability is bestowed upon Link, similar to how Revali's essence gave him access to his ability. This also got me thinking. If you look closely at the teaser, Link seems to be keeling backwards as the hand latches onto him. This could of course mean nothing, but at the same time, what if this is how it saves Link and Zelda in this scenario? It's pretty clear that the two are in serious danger of falling down the bottomless pit surrounding Ganon's corpse. So what if they do fall down and the hand saves them by giving Link its power of flight? This could mean that during this shot, Link is either already falling, possibly with Zelda right below him and he gains the power mid-fall so he can save her and himself, or he's in the process of going over the edge at this moment. Either way, similar to the Sheikah flying machine, this power obviously has to be limited. Maybe it runs on magic, which means we could see a return of the magic meter. Upgrading the meter would then mean being able to fly for longer. So these are a few possibilities as to how. So now let's go over the why. Why would Link need to fly if there's nothing to do in the sky anyway? Some floating platforms and flying enemies are certainly not enough for such a huge addition to the gameplay. Well, as you've probably guessed, the Rising Hyrule Castle could definitely have something to do with it. Which is also where I need to address something that Banoon pointed out to me on Twitter. He claims that the castle isn't the only thing rising up in the final shot, but an area called the Bottomless Swamp as well. Now, I gotta be honest, this might just be part of the overworld fog we often see rolling around in Hyrule's landscape. But if you look closely, you definitely do see a pretty significant cloud rising up in this area at the same time the castle is rising up. There's also a big cloud formation in front of the castle, which would approximately be where the central Sheikah Tower would have been. Again, could be nothing more than just some random clouds which just so happen to form at this exact moment. But it's not too crazy to think that Hyrule Castle isn't the only thing rising, but instead multiple sections of Hyrule will take to the skies, creating an entire cluster of floating islands above the map and leaving enormous craters where they once were. I'd also like to point out that it's a bit weird that the screen is shaking so viciously when whatever is happening to the castle is that far away. In fact, the shaking doesn't start until way later, perhaps an indication that the Great Plateau itself, which is where this footage is taken from, is about to rise up as well. I definitely love the idea of multiple floating islands, and not like in Skyward Sword where they were mostly just a bunch of floating rocks. I mean actual big chunks of land with waterfalls, vegetation, maybe even entire villages that got taken to the sky with it. I mean, can you imagine the shock the people of Hateno Village or the Gorons would endure if something like this were to happen to them? One little hint to the possibility of multiple floating islands is the concept art shown at the GDC, the one where Ganondorf is standing on a giant floating landmass. And as you may notice, this is not the castle floating, but rather seems to be Death Mountain. We of course can also not forget the mothership high up in the sky with smaller vessels around it. Not saying aliens will be the main bad guy, I doubt we'll get Ganondorf and aliens, but it at least shows that the team was toying around with enemies high up in the sky. It could be that Va Meadow was the replacement of that idea, but I just want to cover all options. And speaking of Va Meadow, Age of Calamity already gave us a taste of some airborne combat in the Va Meadow sections. And I don't know about you, but I thought these were pretty darn cool. Your range of motion was severely limited, as was the area you were allowed to fly in, but it at least shows that the vast open space above Hyrule's map lends itself for huge aerial battles. So in terms of story, it could be that Ganondorf rips parts of Hyrule asunder and elevates them to the sky. Each of these islands could be hovering at different elevations, and thus the journey to Ganondorf's castle could be hindered by how far your powers and gear allow you to ascend upwards. Meanwhile, back at the surface, new challenges are awaiting as well. Perhaps the craters left behind by the land that rose up reveals underground caves, which could tie into the underground stuff. Add to that the possibility of underwater traversal, and suddenly revisiting the same map again doesn't seem as redundant anymore. This world would be turned on its head and new provinces wouldn't even be necessary. An example of a story progression in this case would be that as Ganondorf took himself and parts of Hyrule to the sky, you are basically stuck on the ground at first, unable to do much, which would be similar to the Great Plateau in Breath of the Wild, where Link was stuck until he obtains the paraglider and you can start the main quest proper. In this case, you wouldn't be able to leave the surface until you obtain your first ability to fly, be it a Loftwing, a Sheikah vehicle, or the Green Spirit Hand, which then at first allows you to visit some of the lower hanging islands. From there you advance further and further upwards by beating dungeons, upgrade your power to fly, and obtain new abilities. Speaking of which, let's lastly do a quick dive into some additional gameplay options which could work well with the idea of aviation. Obviously a hookshot or grapple hook would make a fine addition to this. I've already talked about something like this in the past, but something that worried me was being able to hit exact targets while falling or flying might be a bit too difficult. Then I suddenly remembered another mechanic which was introduced in Breath of the Wild. The bullet time. Being able to slow down time mid-air would give you ample amount of time needed to hit your targets. Other mechanics could include the option to actually use your weapons while flying, something which wasn't possible with the paraglider since Link needed both hands to hold on. Being able to deploy a small flying device similar to the Beetle, something we have seen Nintendo contemplating on 2 occasions in creating a champion. Maybe the hand's power can give Link a double jump similar to Rock's cape from Minish Cap to get some extra distance, or creating your own platform in the air like the cloud power-up from Mario Galaxy 2, the list goes on. Now, it could be that all the stuff I'm describing is way too ambitious, and it isn't without its problems either. We've seen how in Breath of the Wild people were able to utterly break the game by abusing the physics engine. Stuff like this would definitely make sequence breaking the game a breeze, given that it has a certain order in which you need to complete the main story. So either these glitches, if you can call them that, need to be removed, or since these were made possible because of the Sheikah slate, the slate itself would have to be retired. It would of course be amazing if we get it all. Sky, underwater, and underground. But like I said, that might be asking a bit too much, and I definitely don't want to set anyone up for disappointment here. But we can dream, can't we? One thing's for sure, in order for the sequel to live up to the hype and surpass the Game of the Year winning Breath of the Wild, we're gonna need more than just some new quests and new areas. To what degree, that remains to be seen. And that, my friends, is the last of my thoughts and speculations on Breath of the Wild 2. Now watch as this video becomes totally irrelevant in 1 week's time. But hey, at least we had fun coming up with ideas these last 2 years. As you might expect, this will be my last video until after E3 is over. However, I will be streaming the Nintendo presentation together with some of my friends. So I hope you will join me then, as we will make sure it will be a hype and entertaining broadcast. Until then, this is Dawn, signing off, and have a good one.